Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and I am delighted to welcome you to this episode of Tuesday with a Scholar. We are so delighted to have Tom Hanson from the University of Minnesota speaking on the topic of illiberalism and the rise of nationalism both at home and abroad. What could be a more contemporary topic than that? This talk is made possible by a couple of sources. First of all, our great partners from the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. For any of you who are not part of that organization and would like a little more information about it, the Roseville Library is one of about 35 different venues that they have for classes all around the Twin Cities. We do have an OLLI representative here today, Martha, in the back. You want to raise your hand? Okay, and Martha has brought in some information pamphlets on OLLI. So afterward, if anybody is interested and wants to collect one of those OLLI pamphlets, they're up on the table in front here. Our other sponsor is our financial sponsor, Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, which came into being as a result of the passage of the Legacy Amendment and makes all of these talks possible. We're very much indebted to both these fine organizations. And now I will turn the podium over to Tom Hanson for today's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy, so very much. It's a pleasure to be here back at the Roseville Library. This is such an active program here, and it's a great credit to the library and to Judy to see such an active turnout, even with the weather we have today. The topic today is a difficult one. It's something that we are living through, seeing all around us. The issue of illiberalism, both in our own country and beyond our borders, is perhaps the most fateful challenge and issue of our times. It has many dimensions. We can talk about illiberalism, we can talk about populism, nationalism, nativism, if you will, sort of the anti-immigrant sentiment that one sees in many countries. But the phenomenon has deep roots, and I want to talk about these really deep factors today. Give you a few reflections of my own, but also introduce you to the thoughts of some of the commentators, both past and present, who are reflecting on this very, very fateful and crucial issue that we face today. After my remarks, of course, as always, there'll be time for questions. I look forward to your thoughts and views because, in a sense, we're all in this together as we deal with really what is an existential issue for our democracy, not the least of all. A lot of changes are afoot in the world today, and I sum up some of the underlying ones by just showing these two maps, because from 1945, this really was our mental view of the world. We were at the center of global politics after World War II. We've grown accustomed to that, but the map that's emerging today is this one. Other countries are rising. Other forms of governance are stabilizing and performing, quite frankly, fairly well, especially in terms of long-term planning. What we're really talking about here is the rise of Eurasia, and not just China. Following these past 40 years of globalization. It's exactly 40 years since Deng Xiaoping opened China to the world economy. Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping in January 1978 signed the basic diplomatic agreement between the US and China. Think of all that has happened in the past 40 years. And it's some of these changes that I'll be describing which are at the root of some of the political destabilization that we're seeing today. The concept that democracy and liberalism might be entering a choppy period really hit home in the West, in the heart of the West, in 2016. It was in that year that, to everyone's surprise, the British voted in Brexit to leave the European Union. This was a real shock, and as we've seen since, it's turning into a major, major problem for the European Union and for Britain. The pattern that you see here is one that has been followed in many countries in recent years. Urban areas, the areas that are plugged into globalization, part of the network of the current world economy, voted to stay, especially the London area. But the outlying regions, rural and small town, which perhaps have benefited less from the changes of the past 40 years, voted to leave, and they were the majority. As The Economist put it at the time, the new political divide, the issue that was driving voters above all in that election was immigration, not from the Muslim world, but from within the European Union. The free movement of peoples within the European Union was a sticking point. It's one of the four freedoms of the European Union, the free movement of labor. And Britain said, no, we will not follow that. And we're still dealing with this issue. Shortly after that vote, Theresa May, who was still Prime Minister of Britain, said something very indicative of the mood that is developed now in the West. She said, if you tell me that you're a citizen of the world, then you are a citizen of nowhere. You don't even know what the word citizenship means. Now, it is true, not to get too wonky here, but since the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, terribly bloody war, a real shock to the European system, it was resolved with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which structured the world around nation states. The rights of states, inviolability of borders. This is still the basis of UN law, is the rights of states. It's called the Westphalian system. For all of the transnational supply chains, multinational corporations that have developed, the average citizen is still living in a world of nation states. We can only vote for our national leaders. Unfortunately, there is as yet no world government. When you said that, you've said a lot, because there are today 195 countries. It's growing. This is way up just in the course of the 20th century. 193 official countries in the UN and 2 non-member observers, the Holy See and Palestine, for a total of 195. Try as we might, we cannot get away from this nation-state structure. Even though the crises facing us are global today, the average citizen lives in a world of nation-states, which is kind of what Theresa May was saying in that very famous a comment of hers. There's a columnist in the Financial Times today which he uses his rubric, citizen of nowhere. That is his constant rubric in his column. This concept has taken root over there. Now, of course, still in 2016, just a few months later, another shock, Donald Trump elected president. The same urban-rural pattern emerged, the same rise of sort of marginal parties against the mainstream, and America first will be my theme. Here in this case, The Economist phrased this in terms of the new nationalism. Once again, a looking back to the state. And of course, Donald Trump has been all about bilateral rather than multilateral, even to the UN. At the last UN General Assembly, his speech was all about the need to work bilaterally. He encouraged everyone to think nationally. Now, these tendencies are going back and forth in Europe. Since 2016, a real watershed will be the European parliamentary elections coming up in May. The populist, anti-immigrant, nationalist parties of Europe are uniting to try to make a big splash in these elections coming up. It's going to be kind of a bellwether for that sentiment. And guess who is their guru? Steve Bannon has been over in Europe for the past 8 months or so, actively advising the populist parties of Europe as this election approaches. Now, I think the situation was summed up pretty well by Robert Kagan, who is a very prominent, I guess you could say, neoconservative thinker and policy advisor, quite influential in both of our political parties. And he wrote recently, the question facing us is this: are these trends, and that includes trends here in the US, are they an aberration or are they a culmination? Is this something that is going to pass from the scene in a couple of years, is going to flow and then ebb again? Or are these trends indicative of very deep tectonics that are going to continue to drive our politics? Robert Kagan concludes in his own view that this is a culmination and that we are in for a protracted period of these kind of politics. So there are these trends that I just described at the heart of the Western world. If you know, the West isn't that much of the planet, really, if you look at what the West really is. Basically, Europe and Western Europe, the United States, and the remnants of the British Commonwealth. But these forces and trends are operating worldwide right now. Freedom House, which monitors the state of freedom in the world, in its most recent report late last year, said that democracy faced its most serious crisis in decades in 2017 as its basic tenets came under attack around the world. And they pointed out that for 12 straight years, and now this is the 13th, there has been a decline in political rights and civil liberties around the world. In other words, they've been seeing a trend of this kind for some years now. The Eurasia Group, in indicating its top risks for 2019, came together with a group it calls the Motley Crew of strong leaders, not necessarily all dictators or such, but very strong leaders around the world, a kind of an autocratic tendency. In fact, The Guardian of London, in summing up last year, said it was the year of autocrats worldwide. In many cases, people, for example, Erdogan, Salvini in Italy, are being elected. But then, once in, are beginning to push against some of the democratic structures. That's happening in Poland, Hungary, also parts of Eastern Europe. That's the new pattern. Elections, yes, but then change from within. It's like mushrooms. If you go to Barnes & Noble today, the number of titles on the shelves trying to get at this issue. Jan Werner Miller's What is Populism from Princeton, this book was required reading for all Princeton freshmen last year. Ed Luce of the Financial Times, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. A.C. Grayling, Democracy and Its Crisis. David Runciman, How Democracy Ends. Yascha Mounk, The People versus Democracy. Many, many titles. I find it quite interesting that Hillary Clinton, in her updated version of What Happened, looking back to the election, has a whole new postscript on the crisis of democracy. She enunciates this herself. So, what are the themes that are emerging from all of this rumination about our current state of affairs? I'm going to try to describe some of these. I think that the key factors that people are looking at are first, as always, the economy, the results of globalization after 40 years, the rise of inequality worldwide. I think if there's one theme that is being emphasized in these books, it's inequality and the corrosive effect that that has on any polity. The second theme would be the erosion of social capital. You know, we have always been a very individualistic country. and it's been a real boon for us, but there has been an erosion of social capital, of, if you will, the commonweal of governance in recent years. And it's been in parallel with a rise in identity politics. People finding their identity less at the national level and more in subgroups. Now, just as a democracy, a government cannot transcend the multinational structures, so too a state government cannot function if it falls into subsets. And if people's identifications move away from the governance toward individual groups. Both of those are threats to democracy. The third basic point that I want to discuss is the emergence of other models. And here we'll be talking primarily about China and its way of doing things. China's coming up with a whole new form of governance, which is an amazing thing that we're going to have to be dealing with going forward. And then finally, technology, onrushing technology. It's very destabilizing, whether it's artificial intelligence, and it has many implications for democracy and for how states will be organized. Does the new technology point toward greater freedom and greater democracy, or does it point in the other direction? That's the question that many, many people are reflecting on now. So I'll try to get into those four areas now in my comments, starting with the economy. Now, as we all know, economic financial disruption can lead to political destabilization, and fast. Of course, 1929, this is how it looked as it happened. You know, out here in the Midwest, the Depression had settled in already after World War I, when during World War I, prices went way up because the rest of the world was not producing. A lot of farmers invested, overinvested, and when the war was over, the markets collapsed, and a decade of depression haunted Minnesota and the Midwest leading up to the Depression. This is the farmers' holiday movement, which coalesced. Farmers saying, okay, if we can have a bank holiday for Wall Street, let's have a farmers' holiday for agriculture. We're not going to sell any of our goods to the market. We're on strike. Now, these were disruptive forces based on the economic crisis. In Europe especially, as the crisis unfolded, the instability set in. People found new roles, new identifications, as I say, in very short order. Now, here in the US, we had just very small rumblings of this kind. The silver shirts, politicians like Huey Long, were organizing, but they never, I think in Minnesota, there might have been a total of 800 silver shirts during this period, historians estimate. But it never took the magnitude that happened in European countries. Why not? Well, this gentleman, Eric Hoffer, some of you may remember, he was a personality in the early 1950s, a longshoreman with no formal education, a member of the lower middle class at best, self-taught, who wrote a book called The True Believer. It was President Eisenhower's favorite book. And from inside that class that had gone for Nazism, he tried to explain how that happens. Why do people become illiberal and embrace forces like this? And he put his finger on one factor: the new poor. The part of the population which is doing well, fairly well, believes that their children will live better, and then suddenly slides into uncertainty and into a lack of confidence in the future. That's the dangerous class. That's the class that can be in jackboots, eventually. In other words, it's not the dispossessed, the ones that have not had hope for a long time. It's the ones who are recently arrived in that state. In any country, he said, that allows that to happen to a large part of its population is in for big trouble. Now, in his view, the U.S. was less affected than Europe because of some of the policies we enacted in the 30s. I guess here he's talking about the New Deal that put people back to work through the WPA, other programs. He felt that this had been enough to cushion the blow. But the warning is still there as an historical example of this economic factor that I mentioned. Now, at the end of World War II, of course, we came out of the war intact, with a generation that was patriotic, that was saving at high rates. We had a very high marginal tax rate, about 90%, right through the Eisenhower-Nixon years. And the world during this period was divided. There were walls. The Soviet Union built the Iron Curtain around Eastern Europe. China had walled itself off. India was behind high tariff walls. In this era, the walls were being built by other countries, not by us. In fact, we were calling for an end to these. But the fact is that the world in these years was a cocoon. Labor costs were fairly uniform in the free world. It's estimated that just 17 countries accounted for 95% of free trade up until about 1980. Because the rest of the world, basically Eurasia, was out of the picture. This meant that labor costs were uniform. There wasn't the same kind of outsourcing we have now. Indeed, this is looked back upon throughout the West as the good old age. In France, they call it les 30 glorieuses, 30 glorious years. In some of the political movements we see today, both here and in Europe, there is a nostalgia for this period, especially in the older generation, when things seem to be more intact and rising. Now, of course, this all changed by the late 1970s when China opened up. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. India opened up to the world economy, and suddenly you had an entirely new, radically new situation in which capital was free to seek out the cheapest labor worldwide. And technological improvements with the internet, containerization, allowing mass shipments, led to a radically restructured global economy. And of course, it was the opening of China that in 1978 that really, really drove this process. Now, we thought at this point in the 90s that we had won the Cold War. This was the high watermark of democracy, the high watermark of our values. Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. This is the end of history as such. The irony is that things were beginning to change structurally as globalization went into high gear that would upend some of this. Here you kind of see the world today. It's a world of far-flung supply chains in which, as I say, labor is harnessed to capital beyond national borders. Let's take the Apple iPhone. Conceived in Silicon Valley, completely developed in Asia, all of it, through the supply chains in Southeast Asia, finally assembled in China, and then exported to the US, showing up as a trade surplus for China, ironically. How do you decipher a world economy that operates this way? The former head of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, said at one point, all products today should be marked manufactured globally, because there's almost no such thing anymore as national manufacturing. Well, this has all kinds of implications for societies, and especially for labor. And in many ways, we are seeing now the effects. The global distribution of wealth worldwide has reached unprecedented proportions. This is not just in our own country, but globally. Oxfam every year estimates how many individuals control as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. And they always present this at the Davos conference. Well, this year, 26 families globally have more resources than the 3.7 billion people in the bottom half of humanity. These are statistics that have simply emerged. They, in our own situation, were worsened. I don't think that the 2008 crisis was anything like 1929, but many of the people that I cited earlier point to it as a watershed event in terms of where we are now, because a lot of people have not fully recovered from 2008. If you look at estimated life expectancy, already by 2010, the richest were living a good 12 years longer than the poorest. That is now extended to about 16 years. It's one thing to say you have more money or more homes than I do. Another to say you have more years of life than I do. And this kind of inequality, here you can see we have a particular problem. Our life expectancy is declining today as a result of what? All of our social issues. There's a lot of factors for it, but we are a total outlier compared to the other countries of the OECD. This has been going on for the past several years. These are warning signs. There's no question about it. And there are things that are not going to go away quickly. So, a number of analysts and people that you really wouldn't expect are getting into this issue. I mean, President Jimmy Carter is on record as saying that the United States today is more an oligarchy than it is a democracy. And he sticks to this in many of his speeches. A very conservative thinker like Samuel Huntington from Harvard University, he's the author of a book called The Clash of Civilizations. But in his last book, which is titled Who Are We?, he spoke of a rising global elite that did not have any national moorings and was not interested in the fate of the citizens of their own countries. He coined the term Davos man from the World Economic Forum, and this is now common parlance, Davos man. Steve Bannon uses this term all the time. And Huntington quoted Adam Smith from Wealth of Nations, who wrote, "While the proprietor of land is necessarily a citizen of a particular country in which his estate lies, the proprietor of stock is properly a citizen of the world and is not necessarily attached to any particular country." So this idea has been around a long time. Even Adam Smith warned about it. And we are seeing this evolve today. A fellow named Nils Gilman, who is a deputy chancellor at Berkeley, wrote a very widely read book called The Twin Insurgency. And in his view, there's an insurgency going on against democratic governance from two sides. From below, interconnected criminal insurgencies that are establishing what he calls micro-sovereignties of control. Take Mexico. There are parts of Mexico that are literally governed and run by the drug cartels. No question about it. And there are any number of countries which have this same effect. That's from below. From above, he cites a plutocratic insurgency, globalized elites who seek to disengage from traditional national obligations and responsibilities, especially taxes. There are tax havens all around the world, and the wealthy can easily shield their income. Now, he says that unlike classic 20th century insurgents who sought to control the state, These two insurgencies merely seek to weaken the state, to make sure that it is not capable of interfering in their micro-sovereignties, whether it be gated neighborhoods or shielded wealth or actual drug cartel mini-states. And he says that this, what he calls the enclavization of micro-sovereignties, is a big threat to democracy going forward. So this economic issue, inequality, is front and center in most of the analyses you'll read about the subject. A fellow named Kishore Mahbubani, who is from the Lee Kuan University in Singapore, he has a book out called Has the West Lost It? He makes a big distinction between illiberalism in Europe and illiberalism in the US. He says in Europe, it really is all about immigration. These are unified nation states that are not used to this degree of immigration. Here's Angela Merkel in 2015 when she opened the doors to over 1 million refugees, mainly from Syria, to come in. The pressure on Europe from immigration is only going to increase, as I think it will globally. Here you can see the new immigration coming in since 2015 is mainly from Africa through a destabilized Libya. And indeed, as the global population soars to 11 to 12 billion, we're about 7.6 now, the UN estimates that by the end of the century, 40% of all humans will be living in Africa. That's how high the birth rates are there. And the success of health improvements is causing people there to live longer, thankfully. But the cumulative result is massive growth of population. There'll be tremendous pressure to immigrate. With the wars that are going on, you know, in the 19th, early 20th century, for every 8 military deaths, there was 1 civilian death. Today, with modern warfare, it's the reverse. For every 1 military death, there are 8 civilian deaths. Tremendous pressure out from the destabilized zones. We, in the United States, will be facing this as well. Right now, we have a very restrictive refugee policy. We'll see how that goes. Minnesota has the highest percentage of refugees per capita in the United States, largely because of our very developed social structure of churches and other groups helping on this. So we'll be facing pressure too, but Europe even more. So yes, immigration for Europe, but for Mahbubani, what's driving populism in the US is plutocracy and inequality. He says that the US can handle immigration, it always has, but the uncertainty, the growing uncertainty of a lot of our citizens, the economic results of the past 40 years are causing them to seek scapegoats. And they're landing on immigration. So the economic factor is, as I say, very key. Now, the second point has to do with what they call social capital. And here we're talking about the norms, the kind of common experience, common contributions, if you will, to the nation. Robert Putnam, also of Harvard, some years ago, put his finger on what he found to be a disturbing trend. And here's his definition of social capital. In a book called Bowling Alone, he documented how Americans between 1975 and 2000 began withdrawing, began watching bowling on TV rather than bowling. And that this was leading to a decline in civic, political, religious, and other kinds of connections among Americans. Between 1994 and 2004, there was a 21% decline in that kind of activity, and that only has increased. When you add the new social media to that, which wasn't even around when this book was written, not to the same extent, there is an even growing tendency to this kind of isolation. Malcolm Gladwell, a very popular writer, has written that weak social ties supported by the new media do not inspire deep commitments needed to act for social change. And then we end up living in kind of echo chambers rather than interacting. This goes way back, and I think it's very telling that Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, singled out what he said would be the greatest threat to American democracy and American liberalism. And he said, quote, American individualism, as it's constituted in the U.S., could end up being a problem. And he called it a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows, withdraw into the circle of family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. Plato, way back in ancient times, saw the same threat. He didn't believe in democracy, and he said, citizens will live from day to day, indulging the pleasures of the moment. They will not act as true citizens. Hannah Arendt, who I think gives a very good definition of authoritarianism, when you think everything's possible and nothing is true, has echoes of what we're facing today. But she cited the same point of isolation. And in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wrote, the feelings of superfluousness and isolation, which are characteristic of individual members of the mass, make them ripe for harvesting by demagogues for totalitarian causes. In other words, if the social fabric, if social capital begins to erode, the citizen is thrown back on that kind of isolation and begins to look for new identities. Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the book I referred to earlier on the end of history, has been totally focused in recent year on governance, on the wearing down of norms and actual respect for governance and the mechanisms of governance, which he believes are essential to democracy and even to a functioning state. And his analysis, as I say, really looks at this and asks how we can bring this sentiment back. We've been living since 1980 with the idea that government is the problem. But to counteract some of these trends, it's going to take a concerted effort, he argues, and redeveloping the folkways and mores of that. It's been a long time since civics was taught in our high schools. And that's just one tip of an iceberg, if you will. Here you can see the share of net public wealth in the net national wealth. It's not just in the United States. You can see we're at the bottom there. But in most countries, the distribution has tilted toward individuals and away from any kind of state role or state spending. The one exception to that is Norway, which is blessed with oil wealth, and they're socking it away for future generations. So but as you can see, we are, along with the UK, at the bottom right now. Our own Tom Friedman from St. Louis Park, in his most recent book, really focuses on these issues. He's been a great champion of globalization in books like The World is Flat and others. The idea that this really, kind of like the end of history, this is inexorable. You either get on the bus or you're not on the bus. We're heading toward a globalized world. He realizes now it's not that simple. So in his latest book, he tries to remain a globalist, but say, look, each of us has got to find an anchor. Each of us has to have, if you want to call it the social capital or whatever. He encourages everyone to find that space and to be involved in that space and have it without tipping into nationalism or nativism. And for Tom, that space is St. Louis Park in the 1950s. He has a whole long section of this book, and it's beautiful. I used to hang out at the Lincoln Dell myself, actually, and evoking the St. Louis Park of his childhood in the 50s and just what he portrays as a society with tremendous social capital, optimism, interconnectedness. And he's saying we have to find that again. Now, Amy Chua on the left there, she's the Tiger Mom. Remember that book, The Tiger Mom? and her husband, Jeb Rubenfeld. Both are constitutional scholars at Yale. And they have a new book out called Tribalism. And reflecting on, as I say, this sort of sub-identity movement that's going on in the States now, and they say that this is a great danger to democracy. And they say, what is the nationalism of the United States? And they look back to our founding fathers, and they discern in the early forming of the United States a belief in diversity and in protecting diversity, but a strong exhortation to constitutional nationalism. You know, we're a country of many nations, and they claim that for our founding fathers, it was a almost nationalistic, patriotic adherence to our Constitution and to our laws that set us apart. Now, obviously, that kind of affiliation is not as elemental, not as gripping as some of the other sub-identities we see around us today. But as far as they're concerned, that's how America started, and that's how America will prosper going forward. Now, technology is at the root of a lot of this. This book, The Rise of the Robots, was the book at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, showing that, yes, technology is going to start taking jobs. We're going to have to treat this as a society, find a way to make sure that people are engaged, have a livelihood, because if not, they'll be even more deracinated and more open to some of the lures that are out there. In the midst of all this, as part of social capital, a functioning media is essential. That the citizen be informed, that the citizen be able to have opinions and vote in their own interests. And as we've all seen, media today, given the technology, there's an article today in the New York Times about reporters, journalists being replaced by robots. That basic reporting now can be done with AI. You don't need a live person doing the reporting. And so we've seen, with the development of new social media and cyber attacks from outside our own country, we've seen some instability. I think a very interesting distinction was made by a fellow named Neil Postman in the mid-'80s. He took a look at George Orwell in 1984 and Aldous Huxley in Brave New World and said those two thinkers had different views of what the threat was to democracy. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us, right? Big Brother, that there'd be an attempt by the state to take over the truth. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance, and that we'd end up with a population too narcoticized by undisguised trivialities to engage as responsible citizens. Just saying. I find that a very interesting distinction. And it's something that given the technologies, how do you manage this? But the new kid on the block, and you're going to be reading a lot about this, generative adversarial networks, GAN, also known as deep fake. It is possible, increasingly possible, to produce images and streaming video that cannot be detected as false. DARPA, the U.S. Defense Research Agency, has made this a #1 priority to try to stay ahead of deepfake. What if a video appears of some leader declaring war or who knows what, and a leader has only a short time to react? Deepfake can be manufactured by governments, but also by individuals. So the tech challenge to our social capital, to an informed citizenry, are not lessening. And so we're going to have to be extremely vigilant on this front going forward. Now, Going beyond social capital, the idea that rising powers are producing new models. This is Yascha Mounk, also from Harvard. He wrote the book, The People versus Democracy. And he cites two factors that are leading to our current situation. Number one, yes, inequality. He's got the statistics of what the top 1% have garnered in recent times. But he says, as important is the ability of autocratic regimes to compete with the economic performance of liberal democracies. And he claims that some of these states are beginning to outperform liberal democracies, given their ability to plan long-term and to invest. Just as one example of this, and of course this is all about China, there are 50 what they call unicorns in the world today. A unicorn is a tech company worth $1 billion or more. So, as you can imagine, Google, Huawei in China, any number. Right now, of those 50, 26 are Chinese, 16 are American. Europe is kind of off the picture a bit. In the last 2 years, in terms of research and development spending to try to increase the knowledge and the performance of companies, our top 5 unicorns spent $228 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. Yes, we're a very financialized society. The 5 Chinese equivalents spent only total of 10 billion. Against, the rest was invested. Which system will outperform going forward? We want to keep to our system of governance, for sure, but we cannot ignore these larger factors that are playing out. And Yascha Mounk says that he says, economic performance is more important than values. We can adhere to all the values we want, but if we don't produce economic prosperity for the population, the values are out the window. Now, that's what happened in Europe in the 30s. Didn't happen here. Would it happen here? Now, threats, outside threats, and as I say, the rise of China is starting to be perceived as a threat, can also affect democracy. How a country, nation responds to threat perceptions, threat narratives. Of course, with 9/11, we have invested a lot of blood and treasure in the Middle East. Estimates up to $5 trillion over time. The U.S. Army produced its official history of the Iraq War. It came out just a week or two ago, years in the making. And the conclusion of our military in that study is that there was one victor of the Iraq War, and that was Iran, which is a sad commentary. That threat led to the establishment of the Homeland Security apparatus that we're still living with. You can read a lot about it, to what extent that is an encumbrance for democracy or necessary for our security. Everyone has their own opinion. But now, on the basis of this experience since 9/11, our heads of our intelligence agencies just this week appeared before Congress, Dan Coates, Gina Haskell, to announce that terrorism is no longer the threat. The threat today is China and Russia, as they try to undo the international liberal order and contest with us worldwide. This is the new threat. Now, how are we going to organize ourselves to meet this threat? That is, of course, because wartime and the sense of struggle can lead to perversions of democracy. We are particularly worried that these two countries now are teaming up. Xi Jinping has announced that the Russian-Chinese relationship is the most important in the world today, and our intelligence chiefs say, yes, they really are getting together. Now, in the context of war or supreme threat, countries can lose democracy very quickly. And a disturbing example of that happened right here in Minnesota during World War I. Something called the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety was established. Here's their badge. Basically suspending civil liberties in the context of war. This commission went after not just suspected German sympathizers. As you know, many people changed their names during that period. Our population in Minnesota is, the largest group is German. But they also went after labor unions. They used this clamping down as a pretext to really roll up basic democratic rights. It's a very sorry period in U.S. history, or rather Minnesota history, and in fact it prompted President Wilson during this period to give a speech attacking what was going on in Minnesota, and to say that this is a threat to democracy. This must stop immediately. I cite this just as an example of how, in the heat of war or the heat of threats, it can go out the window very easily. So China, yes, China is rising fast. They've got a lot of problems at home, a lot of inequality in China. They have a debt bomb that might go off at any moment. They have pollution that they're trying to deal with. They're not 10 feet tall. But they are making great progress, especially in technology. Xi Jinping has announced as of 2015 what is probably the largest infrastructure program in the history of the world, the new Silk Road, which will link up Eurasia. 70 countries are cooperating with China, high-speed rail all across this space, ports, hooking up to Africa, Chinese development there. China is run by engineers. Almost all the leaders of China in the party are engineers. We have a lot of lawyers, as you know, but these people are capable of long-term planning with a very strong emphasis on infrastructure. This is being seen as a challenge in Washington today, that their system might be outperforming us. Now, Xi Jinping, since he's come in, he still is for free trade. He announced this at Davos. They're still in the Paris Climate Agreement. They're kind of trying to say we, more than the Americans now, are friends of globalization. But at home, he's tightening up. And under Xi, the Communist Party has come back in. It was quite interesting that late last year, they, with great fanfare, celebrated the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth. And the sleepy little town, Rhineland town in Germany of Trier, found itself one day presented with this, a present from the people of China, a humongous statue of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in Trier. The mayor of Trier did not want to accept this. The Chinese were saying, here, we'll help you put it up in the main town square. The federal government in Berlin said you kind of have to accept it. So as you can see, it looks like a back lot where they're putting it up here. It's definitely not. Anyway, the Chinese are showing signs of doing things their own way. They're not changing fundamentally under globalization as we thought they would. And as I mentioned earlier, a new form of governance may be emerging in China. They are quite proud of this. They think it will be the form of governance that will come to dominate worldwide in harmony with the new technologies. They're putting up facial recognition technology all over the country, and I mean everywhere. You cannot get a roll of toilet paper in a village in far western China without going through facial recognition. There's a lot of theft of toilet paper there, so you get it, but then not again for 12 days. All regulated by facial recognition. Today, if you're crossing at an intersection in Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, if you jaywalk, these are wide streets, by the time you're halfway across, your photo and your personal data appear on a big screen at the intersection. Because the Chinese have announced that with a supercomputer they call exascale that can do a quintillion computations per second, that's a billion, they can locate any citizen within 3 seconds. Now, it's bad enough that it was registered that way, but it means that the state also registered it. Police around China today, this is actual real time, wear sunglasses. A reporter for the New York Times asked one of the police officers if they could borrow the glasses. Probably they weren't supposed to lend them out, but they did. The journalist put them on, looked at someone nearby, and that person's face and data appeared on the inside of the lens. The technology for this exists. It cannot be undone. It's out of Pandora's box. It's not just the Chinese. If you go to London or you're in Britain, the Brits have gone very far in installing facial recognition technology. Around London, there are facial recognition cameras everywhere. This collation of data that the Chinese are actively collecting will, by 2020, emanate into a new structure called the social credit system. Now, there it is. This is the plan. Data collated from all these sources, facial recognition, online activity, people are monitored there very heavily, financial data, whatever, will go into a central score. And citizens will get a score every 6 months, every year, it's not clear, and immediate rewards and punishments will follow. You can lose your license, you won't be able to travel, all kinds of things in the interest of governance. There's a British science fiction program called Dark Mirror, which is kind of the updated Twilight Zone, if you will. They only produce about 6 episodes a year, and but they're onto these themes a lot. A lot of the themes in Dark Mirror, or Black Mirror, sorry, have to do with this new state of facial recognition, monitoring, citizens rating each other, for example. There's one episode, every interaction you rate the person who you interacted with, and you end up with a score, and you can get into this country club, or you can get into this whatever based on your score. The Chinese value harmony and social capital, but there's such a thing as too much harmony and social capital. So when I talk to Chinese students about this, they seem fairly comfortable with it by and large. And one even said to me, well, what's the difference? Right now, data is being collected by semi-autistic, libertarian Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And what's the difference, especially since under Homeland Security, they have to turn that data over to the government if need be. So their response is, look, this exists. We're using it rationally in the name of public order. Well, obviously, this goes way against our traditions of democracy. But the question is, how will we handle this new technology as we move forward? So I kind of maybe gone on a bit longer than I thought. It's all in our hands. I just think we have to recognize the moment we're in. We have to take governance seriously. We have to take a larger perspective on our society, in my view, and on the technology that around us very seriously, and not just leave it to chance. Not do what Tocqueville said we would and get involved in our own little private cocoons. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
And I look forward to your questions too, but please let me bring the mic around so we can all hear all the questions. So who has the first question? Yes, sir.
It sounds like technology is the big thing to be feared since it's hard to control. And after doing this in China and Russia, what to prevent it from starting other countries, and also in our own country to control us with technology that we don't want?
It's going to take tremendous citizen vigilance. This is not a lightheaded game anymore. This is not, we're in a new phase. I agree. Once this technology is out there, there'll be strong tendencies to try to use it. Other countries are looking at what China's doing and are beginning to implement, not to the same extent and not in such an organized fashion, but still they're starting to implement this. Tech can be a real savior. For example, there's both in genomics and in the study of the brain. There are all kinds of interesting things happening, that can potentially cure disease. Other countries, though, have a different approach to tech. A new term that's being used a lot in the field is translational technology. The idea that you translate tech immediately into an application, which is what China is doing. We have all kinds of laws against doing that. For example, genetic engineering. Very strict limits on going even a short distance toward trying to perfect the population. As you may have seen, in China, the first genetically engineered babies were born, twin girls, that had been enhanced. This would be totally against the law in the United States. There was some criticism of this fellow in China, but still, Jennifer Doudna, who was one of the people who discovered the CRISPR technology that allows us to do this very precise genetic editing, coming back from conferences in Asia, says that other countries are very much thinking of improving their populations when the possibility is really there. They have no qualms about that. We do, thankfully. Same thing, in monitoring our brain activity, the synapses. This can help paraplegics to move prosthetic limbs, to do all kinds of things. But just in the past week, there have been breakthroughs at Columbia University and in China which show that it's possible to, in effect, or will be, to read your thoughts before you enunciate them, to look at genetic patterns and decipher where this is going in terms of speech. This will allow people who've lost the ability to be able to speak, kind of with a voice like Stephen Hawking's perhaps. But once again, the implications, I don't know what to say. As far as I'm concerned, it's Pandora's box. I agree that there will be a very strong tendency to try to use this stuff, and all the more we've got to, as citizens, be aware and get out in front of this and not take it all as the latest gadget, or the latest billionaire. That's all great, but the implications are staggering for all of this. I'm not a pessimist on this, by the way.
This gentleman in the back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering, we're with the emergence, as you mentioned, of income inequality in the last, let's say 20, 30 years, how it's exploded. Assuming that we would have stayed out of all these needless wars, especially the Muslim world, an area that we've never understood and still don't, and it's a mess. How are we ever going to figure that out? God only knows. But let's assume we didn't do that and put all that money into our country. Would that have made a dent in income inequality, especially for jobs for the middle and lower class?
It might have. The last couple of presidents, President Obama was very much in favor of infrastructure at home. They even used to talk about nation building at home. And as you know, the Congress right now is talking about an infrastructure program, perhaps. One problem we have with it is that our debt is exploding. With a $1.5 trillion tax cut late last year, unfunded, huge increases coming in defense spending to face China and Russia, and then we add infrastructure to that. Where does the money come from? Now, if it's $5 trillion, yes, that could have been plowed into all kinds of things here at home. It could have been used to help develop the region to our south. I mean, maybe we should be helping Mexico. Maybe we should have high-speed rail going all through North America and the region. I mean, the kind of things that China's doing over there. Why don't we do that here? Whether that would have gotten at the inequality is hard to say. Very briefly, President Eisenhower and then on to Nixon basically accepted the New Deal. You could have had a Republican president come in 1952 and undo the whole thing. It wasn't until Ronald Reagan that the beginning of undoing aspects of the New Deal, and the real changes came under Bill Clinton with the deregulation of the economy. And our marginal tax rate now has gone way down. Should we have more of a progressive tax rate? In addition to what you mentioned. At the Davos conference this year in Switzerland, it was all about taxes. the fact that that the rich are not paying taxes, and that there's this empire of tax havens out there, and that at some point this has got to be addressed. And so I think a combination of maybe more rational use of our wealth and infrastructure spending could help.
We have a question over here.
What's the possibility that the very rich, the Trumpists and the Chinese will come up with a way of finding people who want to be eliminated from being parasites, so that the makers will simply get rid of the takers by defining a good death as a right which the takers should demand?
Well, it's like Hannah Arendt said, everything is possible and nothing is true. I mean, that would be a very Orwellian narrative. We have to hope it doesn't go there. I will say that there was a sense when Obama first came in of what they called the G2, that at some point China and the US might actually see that they really have a lot in common, and that it could be a world that might be more and more directed by that duopoly. It's going exactly the opposite direction now. But your question touches on something fundamental. Yeah.
You've said that we need an informed population to address these issues and demand changes to avoid the imminent perils here. And you've done a very good job of explaining the problem to us in an hour. How do you propose, and we're willing listeners, how do you propose that we communicate this to the general voting population?
How to communicate this? At a certain point, it takes leadership. It takes candidates who can enunciate these issues in a way that can be comprehended by the population. It's not going to happen on its own. In the world of social media and the new kind of internet age, we're all consumers, basically. We're not actors, we're consumers. We're being marketed to. It's not a realm of citizenry, if you will. And how to take the narrative out of that space where most of us now reside into the public forum and enunciate it in a way that is comprehensible. I think it's going to take, hopefully, more than many leaders who will begin to talk about this. Right now, it's a bit of a cacophony. Everyone realizes things are not going in the right direction. Many voices. How many candidates are there now on the Democratic side? But it's not going to happen on its own. I guess I don't see, and it's going to be hard for individual citizens to break through. I mean, obviously, if we vote for people like that, that would be the ideal scenario. But I think at key points of U.S. history, we've had strong leadership. And I'm a boomer. And we've had 4 boomer presidents, and all of them fine individuals, but I personally have not seen the kind of leadership that we would need in this situation. It's very clear that most of our Congress has no idea about tech, for example, right? A lot of our elected officials are not really, if you look at some of the hearings. But I think it's going to take leadership, and we should be on the lookout for it. Yeah.
Sorry. I'd like to go back to the Chinese data card. I'm not quite sure what
Social credit system.
Social credit system. I'm thinking, okay, if I want to borrow money, I have a credit score. If I want to vote, I have a voter registration. If I want to own a house, I have a property tax, et cetera, et cetera. We have many of these items, but they are not centralized or coordinated. Maybe a very naive question, but isn't this a better way?
Well, that's a very good question. You're echoing some of my Chinese students here. Yes, it's true that the technology allows for this kind of data collection, as you described, in sub areas of the. It's a very powerful marketing tool as well. So a lot of the data that's being amassed is being translated into marketing. I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel like I'm being followed around. You know, I go to a website and suddenly all these ads are popping up from. I mean, I take your point. The thing is, you know, would we want all of that technology and that monitoring centralized the way the Chinese are doing? You could argue that a centralized approach would allow for greater coordination among these various things and would prevent exploitation of the technology by smaller groups, potentially. I know the Chinese are very distrustful of each other, and I've had students say to me, you know, at least this way we know people are behaving. And by the way, another word they have for this is panopticon, right? Panopticon, all seeing. The idea being that even if the system isn't perfected, the average citizen won't know for sure. And therefore, the effect will be panopticon. I don't know. You know, I believe that we do need to get back to governance more and respect for governance. But this makes me nervous, I have to say. And it's going to be the challenge of the future. How to balance this out. And there are many voices now that are just basically saying that technology points away from liberalism, away from democracy. That they're already concluding that. I hope that that's not true. Yes?
I hope they can eliminate robocalls.
If they can, if they can eliminate robocalls, then I think many people will embrace this. You know, maybe the new narrative about getting a handle on these ought to include elements like this. A candidate promising no more robocalls might get a lot of votes, actually.
We have a question back here.
Yes.
If there's a governance spectrum, and we're on the highly individualistic
Yes.
end, and China's on the highly social harmony end,
Yep.
is there an ideal central location?
You know, there, you know, some members of the European Union have had a more mixed economy, for example, than we have, maybe learning the lessons of the 1930s. So I know when I'm in Europe, a lot of Europeans make a big distinction between what they call Rhineland capitalism and Anglo-Saxon capitalism. The idea that the Anglo-Saxon countries, US and Britain, have gone the farthest in deregulating and financializing their economies. Whereas countries like Germany, there's still a strong role for labor unions. They sit on the boards of companies. The ratio of CEO pay to the average pay is far less than here. So I guess that would be an example of a somewhat more mixed economy, and I think that that's the reason that this fellow Mahbubani that I mentioned from Singapore says that in Europe it's not as much the economic uncertainty that's driving this as it is immigration. Remember Peggy Noonan, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Wall Street Journal, after our 2016 election, said this was the revolt of the unprotected. Because in addition to inequality, there's uncertainty. You know, our healthcare system is in constant flux. I think a lot of people feel uncertain in addition to just the overall inequality. So yes, there are some countries that have, I guess you could say, or Scandinavian countries traditionally have had this, whether you call it social democracy or a mixed economy. Now, leaders like Orban in Turkey or even Putin are saying we have illiberal democracy. They're trying to say we have democracy, but it's an illiberal. They use that term to indicate that it's not going to be the Anglo-Saxon model, but rather something different. So yeah, there really is a continuum, very much.
This lady has a question.
Yes.
On this social credit system, who's going to determine what social behaviors are positive and which are not?
The party, the Communist Party.
So the powers that already exist.
This will reinforce, and this will happen in almost any situation where this technology is used, will reinforce the power of whatever structures are in place.
Does that not reduce the ability to adapt and to be creative?
That is a threat. You know, China's education system is still very much based on rote. I see at the university Chinese coming over wanting to learn more about how to be creative. But within their existing system, they're beginning to make the breakthrough. The research and development spending is way ahead of ours now. More patents are coming out. So there's some indications that even with a system like this, they can do things. You know, one thing I think about sometimes is what motivates people. Now, we seem to think that it is money, basically, it's wealth. But there have been examples through history of where honor or other feelings can motivate people as strongly as the pecuniary urge. And so I know that in Chinese society, going all the way back, you know, they see reality as a whole of ever-shifting changes, right? The I Ching is all about that. They don't posit a God so much or the world as a machine. They see it as more unified. And as a result, their highest, it's going way back, value is harmony. And Xi Jinping today talks about a harmonious society, a harmonious world. This really is something that motivates the Chinese. It's a different mindset. Yeah, this is going to play out in a different way, but these technologies, you know, will tend to be reinforcing of power.
Here's a question.
Yeah, what you just mentioned goes back to Confucian thinking,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
It's still there, yeah. You say engineers are dominant in China,
Yes.
and they're into efficiency and long-term thinking, as you say. This looks like something an engineer would come up with.
Doesn't it, though?
Right.
Yes. I mean,
But democracy has often been referred to as very inefficient. Winston Churchill said if you talk to the average person, for 5 minutes, you'd have serious questions about democracy.
yeah. Except for all the other systems, you know. You said, yeah.
Or you don't want to see two things made, sausage and laws.
Right.
Right, okay. So anyway, it was brought up earlier. This doesn't look too bad to me.
You know,
Yeah, compared, when you look at some of the stuff that's going on in the U.S.
I mean, this makes me a little uneasy because, you know, there are statistics from Pew and other research institutes showing a stark generational difference in the U.S. about democracy. The boomer generation is like 72% put democracy way at the top of their list. Among millennials, it's far less. It's in the 20s, late 20s or 30%. They have other things that are more important. So yeah, the social mores are shifting even in our own country right now. Well, it does, and even. But even more, there's another tradition called the legalist tradition in China, and the philosopher was Han Feizi, who was preeminent when the Qin dynasty, the Chinese state, was founded. And his theory was people are not naturally good. They're not. And you've got, therefore, to have a strong leader who implements a strong system of incentives and disincentives. And that's exactly what this is. I mean, this is legalism. On steroids, if you will.
We have a question.
Hi. You've described the distribution of economic strength and political power, but you haven't mentioned military, and maybe that's one of the problems with our country, is that's how we think. But do you have any comments about how it's unequally distributed?
Yes, absolutely. We are still far outspending the rest of the world militarily. We have over 800 bases around the world. And as I mentioned, in response to the challenge now of China and Russia, we have announced, Jim Mattis announced this earlier last year, massive increases in defense spending, up towards $750, toward $800 billion. Now, in 1957, when Sputnik went up, which was a similar challenge in a way, we responded with massive investment in education. The National Defense Education Act, which many, many people profited from in science, language learning, all kinds of things. Our response right now is to build walls and increase our military spending. while countries like China are investing massively in infrastructure. China is spending more relatively, but they're still way, way lower than our military spending. And I think a key to understand what's going on is that both China and Russia are trying to create strategic depth in their own regions, which is different from challenging us worldwide, which is what happened during the Cold War. Russia wants no further encroachment by NATO. They're pushing back in Georgia and Ukraine. China is looking at what they call the first island chain, where Taiwan and the South China Sea are, and they are spending in that perspective, which is different from a global challenge. The challenge to us globally is in tech and in the kinds of economic programs the Chinese are engaged in. They're not challenging us as much militarily, although the new technologies will have military implications. And so Washington is nervous at, China right now is far ahead in what they call 5G. The new Huawei is the world leader. One reason we're reacting against them. And I had a Chinese contact tell me the other day that they're already well into 6G. And so whatever the heck that is, I can't even imagine. But so yeah, the military thing, I think that we maybe remain a little too focused. It's not the Cold War anymore. This is a different kind of world that's emerged. It's not a heavy country like the Soviet Union spending above its means on the military to challenge us globally. This is something different. It's like we're fighting the last war.
This lady has a question. Hi.
Yes.
So given that harmony is such a high value, which I would distinguish from order,
Mm-hmm.
and given that the Tao was such a strong foundational philosophy, and the prominence of nature and looking to nature for wisdom, guidance, ingenuity, what is the role of the natural world and harmony with that, and looking for the solutions that nature offers us for China?
That's a very good question. The Chinese, after centuries of a difficult history of wars, civil wars, Maoism, they've been focused on economic growth and economic development since 1978, to the exclusion of other considerations. And now they've woken up to the fact that they have a huge problem with pollution. And pollution of the water, in all aspects. It's staring them in the face. I was in Beijing a couple of years ago during what they called the airpocalypse, where the air you couldn't even see, and this fine particle pollution goes into your lungs and stays. It never leaves. And by the way, India is far more polluted than China. Of the top 20 most polluted cities in the world, 13 are in India. None are in Asia. So they are beginning to invest in the technologies. They also see market opportunities. So whether solar, other kinds of technologies that get at these issues, because they see this as a real threat to their future. I think that there is a kind of a nature mysticism in China, but it hasn't been the dominant reflex in recent times. So, yeah. Yes.
You've laid out this whole litany of hazards we face, and I think we could use some help from our educators here.
Yeah.
For example, we don't teach civics anymore. Whose idea was that?
It just sort of fell by the wayside.
Just so you can pick out from the menu what you want to answer. We also don't teach journalism. So kids don't know the difference between news and facts versus propaganda. We don't teach editors. I'm not sure we teach librarian courses for librarians anymore.
Yeah.
And as far as tech goes, are you familiar with the bridge that collapsed in Florida, the Florida International University Design Bridge? Mm-hmm. 100-year design, collapsed in 5 days with nobody on it.
Yeah.
Killed 6 people.
Oh dear. Yeah, that's worse than our bridge.
And now the NTSB needs 2 years to figure out it's a bad design?
Yeah, yeah. No, we've got to, I mean, if you look at the Silicon Valley community, and people in tech, more than anyone else, they are steering their kids away from tech, especially in the early years. And they're trying, and a lot of the best elite schools around the country now would look like a 1950s school to most of us, right? The people who understand this and have the wherewithal are doing what you say. So how do we, I mean, I think we need to reintroduce, yes, civics, area studies, how do you understand the world outside? A big issue is this, you've got the millennials, but there's a new group coming up. We see them at the university already now. They're calling them iGen. Now, these kids have been with iPhones since they were born, pretty much, right? I mean, they're just wedded to their phones. And there are consulting firms around the country now advising institutions like the MacArthur Foundation or some of our small colleges saying that, look, you got to adapt. This new generation does not do narrative. They are used to kind of fragmented image-based accumulation of knowledge. They're responsive to stories and storytelling. They're responsive to events, but don't try to throw a sustained logical narrative at them. Now, I mean, really, this is, first of all, and some of these institutions are going along with this. I mean, I think if that's the case, then we got to really actively counteract it and not adapt to it, because heaven forbid that our citizenry ever really got to that point. Once again, it's going to take, we're going to have to take these issues so seriously. And I get nervous when things are not being talked about, when they're being swept under the rug. For whatever challenge that I've talked about today, for me, they pale in comparison to just not talking about this stuff and letting it go unnoticed, because that is, I mean, I think we still have the capacity to respond to this. We always have in our past. But it may take a little bit of getting back to some basics, and harnessing the tech.
We have a question over here, and I think it might have to be the last one.
Yeah.
I hope this isn't a bit of a digression, but...
I've been digressing the whole time here, so go right ahead.
Well, this will just make it worse. You talked extensively about China, and I found it tremendously interesting. I'm curious if you have anything to say about India. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a country that is actually soon going to pass China in population.
Absolutely.
It's much less advanced economically, but right now it's got a very high rate of economic growth. I don't know, maybe in 20 years it's going to be just as much of a world power as China. Anyway, I'm just curious what you think on that subject.
Yeah, I mean, India is really essential. And on the geopolitical side, we're trying to work with India kind of as a counterweight to China. India is a very independent country, doesn't want to be a second player to us or anyone else, so they're going to go their own way. Oftentimes people speak of India as a democracy with all the advantages and failings that go along with it. And they'll say, well, China has a short-term advantage because of this long-term planning, but India will prevail because it's a democracy. So far, India's democracy, which is quite decentralized, quite federalized, has prevented coordinated long-term economic planning. The investment in infrastructure, in ports, airports, lags woefully behind. And that's why India's become good at everything that doesn't require infrastructure. Call centers, tech around Bangalore, that's services, that's their strong point. So they're going to have to take a step beyond the failings of their democracy to get at some of their problems. I've been to India quite a bit, and beneath the surface, they still have a caste system. It's hard to imagine a real functioning democracy that still has that very, very antiquated outlook. And believe me, even the elites still adhere to it. So I see India as having much potential, but some liabilities. And yes, India will have probably the same number of people that the whole world had in 1900, up to 1.8 billion people. and it's going to be very important.
I think we've run out of time for our formal program. I know some of you still have questions. Professor Hanson perhaps could stay a few minutes. But thank you all very much. Come back next week for Duchess Harris.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.